I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming everyone, those online, on YouTube and in the room, to our 50th anniversary conference of the Science and Religion Forum. I wonder how many of those early founders would have expected us to still be meeting here to discuss today, and it is delightful to see some of those that were involved in the very early days of SRF in the room with us. While some of the topics may be different, the focus on research at the heart of the debate kind of still remains the same. And the thing that I think SRF really brings to the conversation is we have always been a friendly and compassionate forum, and a place where we really encourage and nurture debate around science and religion, whether you are a sixth form student, you know, new to your career, an early career researcher, or you've been doing this for decades. Like, it's a friendly place where actually everyone has an opportunity to speak and engage in that dialogue. And I think that is one of the things that has always drawn me to SRF, and something I'm really proud that we are continuing as chair. Sorry, I made this on my phone. I thought I could read this on my phone, and I'm now so old that I should have brought my laptop. So we hope that yet again we have a space for a range of voices, open dialogue, and lots of opportunity for networking. Those of you who are joining us online, we hope you also have a chance to have that dialogue and do, like we say, put your questions in the chat. I'm really excited that this conference not only reflects on the past of where this dialogue has come from, but really as a forum and as a community, we start to look forward to the future. And I think really think about what those new challenges might be. And whilst we have some obvious challenges around AI, the rise of technology, you know, declining congregation numbers in churches, I think whilst the academic conversation may have progressed, some of those questions of the public consciousness actually remain the same. They are those fundamental questions around evolution, around the problem of evil, around personhood and who we are and how we interact in the world. And so I'm really excited that actually there is opportunity to continue those conversations. And with this awareness of the kind of often divergence between the academic questions and the public consciousness, we have been so pleased this year to partner with the Hibbert Trust, who have been able to fund places at our conference for those that would otherwise have been unable to attend. And in the way of all the best events, we do now have a word from our sponsors, and I hope this is not going to go horribly wrong. I'm looking at Matt to fix it if it does. Next slide. Yeah. So we have a brief 4-minute word from our sponsors.
I'm James Croft, the University Chaplain and Lead Faith Advisor at the University of Sussex, but I'm here today in my capacity as a trustee for the Hibbert Trust. We sponsored your conference, so I want to start by saying happy 50th anniversary. I hope you have a fantastic time as you revisit and reimagine the relationships between science and religion. We partnered with the forum to provide conference and accommodation bursaries for attendees. So if you are a recipient of one of the Hibbert Trust bursaries, a special welcome to you. The Hibbert Trust seeks to make an important contribution to the challenges facing the current and future world. And we do this through encouraging leading-edge radical thinking to benefit progressive, liberal, free and inquiring religion fit for the 21st century. We promote education towards ethical maturity for all ages, which helps people have full, engaged and meaningful lives. What does this mean concretely? We give out money. We give out money to people like you. We support postgraduate study in liberal religious ideas and practice, including funding for books. Yes, we will give you money to buy books. We support researchers to help them defray the costs of their research. We support publications promoting liberal religious thinking and debate. And we will help you attend events, lectures, seminars that encourage liberal religious thought and dialogue. What do we mean by liberal religion? Well, we take a very broad approach to that. Liberal religion is for anyone with an open mind and who has tolerant and inclusive views. It's a term which usually describes someone who embraces the freedom of being in a faith community that doesn't impose creeds or specific beliefs, but it's for anyone who bases their approach to religion on reason rather than dogma. And that's why we thought it was a good fit for a conference about the relationships between science and religion. Here are some of the things that we have funded recently. We funded a project called Race and Class in UK Religious Studies and Theology, which aims to provide an institutional platform for monitoring and challenging ways in which the disciplines of religious studies and theology in UK higher education exclude and disadvantage UK minority ethnic and working class students and staff. We helped a PhD researcher attend the American Academy of Religion's annual conference, giving them £2,325 to get them there and back. We helped a would-be student seeking an MPhil at the University of Cambridge afford their tuition fees, giving them a grant of £5,000. We helped a performance artist put on a one-woman show about an unfairly forgotten Sidmouth suffragist. And we helped some of you attend a conference like this. But at the Hibbert Trust, we have one major problem. We get too few applications. We have money to give out, and not enough people want it. And that's why I'm here today, to invite you to apply. Go to our website, thehibberttrust.org.uk, and make an application. The deadline for this funding round is the 18th of October for consideration on 8th of November, so you've got plenty of time to get an application in. Do you want to do another degree in religious studies? Do you want to travel to a faraway conference? Do you want to set up a lecture series about liberal religion? The Hibbert Trust can help, but only if you apply. Thank you and enjoy the lecture.
I think that's round of applause. I'm now going to hand over to Jen to do the details of today as our new conference secretary. So, Jen.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our annual Gowland Lecture. The Gowland Lecture is in honour of Bill Gowland, founder of the Christ and the Cosmos Initiative, which merged with the Science and Religion Forum in the late 1980s. And it's a great honour and pleasure to be able to host this lecture each year in his honour. It's also a great pleasure and honour to welcome our speaker for this year's lecture, Bishop Richard Cheetham. Bishop Richard is formerly Bishop of Kingston. He was Bishop of Kingston from 2002 to 2022. His background is in physics and philosophy and religious thought in the modern society, and he was once upon a time a physics teacher. He's currently working with the project Equipping Christian Leaders in an Age of Science, known as ECLAS, and is a member of the Anglican Communion Science Commission. So, Bishop Richard, thank you so much for agreeing to do the Gowland Lecture for us. It's a great honour and pleasure to have you with us this evening.
Thank you very much, Jen, for that kind welcome. And thank you to all of you for being here, both those who are present in the room and those who are listening online. It was very important, I think, what we heard from the Hibbert Trust to make the science and religion conversation and world really work. Of course, it needs good grants and good money, but it also needs people with commitment and time. And many of the people in this room have given tremendously over many, many years towards that, for keeping this really important engagement between science and religion, not just alive, but thriving. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that as we go on. So it's a great honour, and I'm very pleased indeed to be able to give this Gowland public lecture on this really important occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Science and Religion Forum. And I'm really grateful to the organising committee for all the hard work that's been done to set up this conference at a key time, I think, in how we approach the science and religion engagement. I feel a particular connection with the Gowland Lectures, partly because I served as a vicar in Luton in the 1990s, where Bill Gowland had established the Luton Industrial College, which was still going in those days, and I attended a number of courses at that college. And I was very impressed with his commitment and spirit to ensure that Christian faith truly engaged with the modern world in all its aspects. It was thoroughly an outward-looking vision. Part of that engagement, of course, was with science, and this was reflected by the Christ and the Cosmos initiative, which Bill started, and which eventually merged with the Science and Religion Forum. I attended one of the Christ and the Cosmos conferences back in 2002, when I was then Archdeacon of St Albans, and had the privilege of preaching the sermon at the final service of that event. So I very much hope that what I say in this lecture tonight will build on that very strong foundation and legacy of Bill Gowland. The significance of the current moment for science and religion engagement, I think, has been captured very well in the overall title for the conference: Revisiting and Reimagining the Relationships, note the plural, between science and religion. Most of the literature in the relationships between science and religion has been produced on the whole in a Western context and with an emphasis on the Christian religion. However, there is an increasing awareness of the wisdom and insights generated in many different contexts, cultures and religions, including indigenous knowledge. Of course, that's always been there on one level, but I think that's growing to a much, much more significant part of the conversation today. There's also a growing appreciation that some of the major issues of the 21st century, such as artificial intelligence, genetics, climate change, biodiversity loss, and so forth, require far more than a narrow-focused scientific analysis from a predominantly Western viewpoint. In a globalized, hyper-connected world, these issues need to be explored with ethical, philosophical, spiritual, and theological lenses. And it's equally important to pay close attention to the crucial effects of context on how those science and religion relationships are understood. This lecture is going to explore how such an intercultural approach is working in the Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science project. I'll use the shorthand ECLAS, so I don't have to say all those words every time I get there. And I'm a co-director of that. And also, I'm going to refer to the work of the Anglican Communion Science Commission, of which I am a member. And both of those work inter-contextually in a very significant way. And I'm then hoping to outline some principles for a genuinely fruitful science and religion relationship into the future. Now, as a fairly large caveat right from the start, I want to say that what I'm offering you this evening is the perspective of one person from a particular context albeit fairly well connected with others from different contexts. So the best I can hope for this evening is to scatter a few seeds containing ideas for the future development of science and religion. And as I say, the plural is well chosen in the title, in the hope that a few of them might take root and then be nurtured by others, perhaps some of those present, perhaps some of those online, wherever they may be. And as a first step in that, I'm very grateful indeed to Dr. Muthraj Swamy, who is the director of the Cambridge Centre for Christianity Worldwide, for giving the initial response to the lecture once I've finished. So after these brief introductory remarks, the lecture is going to have three main parts. I'm going to do some looking back at the science and religion relationships in the past, then a bit of looking around the world today at various different contexts and cultures to describe some of the things that are going on, and then a section looking forward to how we might create and continue a flourishing science and religion engagement as we go ahead. Now, in looking back, I am very well aware that we have some very distinguished historians of science, not least in this room, who are much better than me, much better equipped than me to look back with real depth and breadth of scholarship. So rather than attempting a magisterial overview for which I'm not qualified, I hope you will forgive me if I begin with a little bit of my own story relating to science and religion. When the Science and Religion Forum began in 1975, I was in my first year as an undergraduate at the University of Oxford. I was studying, as I think you've heard in the introduction, physics and philosophy. It was then a relatively new combination for Oxford. It had been going about 10 years then, and I was the first person at Corpus Christi College to do it, so I was a bit of a trial for them, perhaps in more senses of the word than one. The roots of my choice of subject lay in my secondary school years. I was 11 in 1966, and my family moved from just south of Manchester to South London. And there's a picture there of me at the school, Kingston Grammar School, where I went. Now, initially at age 11, having moved from what was then the north down to London, I had no friends there of my own age. And so when a lad from round the corner said, would I come to this thing called Pathfinders? I thought, well, okay. The great benefit as far as I was concerned, there was some football and I would meet some people. But it was that got me going through into a church. And as I progressed through my secondary school years and became more and more engaged and committed in the Christian faith, I was increasingly specialising at school in science and maths, and physics in particular. It was an exciting era of very rapid technological development, including, of course, the extraordinary moon landing in 1969, with the iconic images of the Earth from space. So to me as a teenager in those years, a very obvious question was how the understanding of life and the universe, which was being opened up to me through the wonders of science, related to all that I was learning about God, Jesus, and the Christian faith, and all that was telling me about the purposes of life. I can remember thinking as a teenager, musing as perhaps you do in teenage years on life, the universe, and everything, that you either need to be a thoroughgoing atheist, real proper atheist. All there is stuff, matter, molecules, and we're just rather complicated arrangements of that. There's no ultimate meaning other than that which human beings create in our own minds. Or if that doesn't satisfy you, you need to be some kind of theist, that there's a deeper reality, which we use the word God to point towards. The question, of course, was which was right? What approach do you take? In the church youth club, we used to sing a song, the title of which was Can It Be True, which is why the guitar's up there. I used to try and play it. There was only the 4 chords I could play on the guitar were for that one, so maybe it stuck because of that. But the lyrics of Can It Be True were referring to the extraordinary claims of Christian faith, that in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we can discover both the fullness of God and also the meaning of our lives in the midst of the vastness and complexity of the universe. So it's very obvious to me that the question of truth was absolutely fundamental. Both science and religion claim to be truth-seeking enterprises. And so very early on for me, the seeds were sown about the importance of truth, both in science and in religion, and how it worked out in the relationship between the two. At that time, in the 1960s and early 1970s, I discovered several very interesting, well, to me, interesting books and helpful ones, including one which had been published in 1955, which happened to be the year of my birth, and also, some of you probably are aware, it was also the year that Einstein died. No connection, of course. The book was called Science and Christian Belief by Charles C.A. Coulson, who was then Professor of Applied Maths at the University of Oxford. He was also a Methodist lay preacher and served on the World Council of Churches. So he may well have known Bill Gowland, I guess. In that book, Coulson spoke of the need for what he called an act of reflection, to bring together the insights of both science and religion in order to gain a fuller picture of the nature of reality. And that was certainly very informative on me in my teenage years, and I've continued to value that perspective and his contribution to the vast quantity of literature that's been produced on the relationships between science and religion. After university years, I trained, as you've heard, as a science teacher and taught physics for 5 years in 2 very different types of school. One, a large comprehensive school up in North Yorkshire, and then at Eton College, which was a rather different sort of experience. One of my concerns at the time when I was doing that science teaching was that there was relatively little embedded in the curriculum about the history, philosophy, or sociology of science. There wasn't much space to do that in the science curriculum. And I'm really pleased that there's a very good emphasis on all of that in this conference today, because I think that broader context within which science is done is extremely important to get into our education system. And I'll return to that a little later in the lecture. Over the last 50 years, since the life of this Science and Religion Forum, I've become increasingly aware of the limited nature of my own perspective, simply because of my upbringing and the background that I've come from. A single human being brought up mainly within a Western cultural context. It so happens that all the 3 main educational establishments, Kingston Grammar School, Oxford University and King's College London, all happen to have Latin mottos. That probably tells you something about my particular context. They all happen to be quite decent mottos, actually, as it happened, because you do get some rather poor mottos, even if they're in Latin and sound posh. You then translate them and you think, well, that's pretty obvious, or rather banal. But those 3 actually had decent mottos. When I left Kingston Grammar School, the headmaster gave me a copy of The History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. And in the front of it, he wrote, "Every good wish for Oxford philosophy." And he capitalised, fair enough on Oxford, but also philosophy. And that's reminded me, it's remained a reminder to me of the particular cultural context out of which I have come and which has shaped me. The range of issues which have arisen within that context, you will be very familiar with indeed, I'm sure, some of you. How are we to understand the nature and being of God in the light of modern science? How do we relate the theology of creation to theories of the Big Bang and evolution? How do we understand divine action in our world in the light of scientific understandings about how the world works? Whether or not theology, literally talking about God, has any meaningful content at all. The secularization thesis that with modern science that it will inevitably lead to the diminution of religious belief. And of course the persistent conflict narrative between science and religion, and the more recent rise of the so-called new atheist movement. The list, as you know, could go on and on. There have been many, many excellent books on these subjects, and they are very important questions. And I have certainly grappled with them over the years, as have many others. And that, I'm sure, will continue. But during these last 50 years, the lifetime of the Science and Religion Forum, I've certainly experienced three particular developments which I think have slowly begun to change more and more the context in which the science and religion conversation happens. The first of those is theological, or might be called theological. When I was at theological college in the mid-1980s, the influence of liberation theology, black theology, feminist theology was all becoming much, much more prominent. And all of those share the assumption that the context in which the theology is done and the viewpoint of the particular communities and individuals is extremely important in the methodology of theology. You couldn't assume that there was a grand overarching way of doing theology which was simply context-free and worked in a simple way for everyone. So that was the first sort of shift that I think is obviously continuing today. The second might be called more philosophical. My doctoral studies at King's College London took place on a part-time basis when I was a vicar in Luton in the 1990s. It was a time when postmodernism was much talked about, and there was considerable scepticism about the concept of truth, certainly an idea of universal truth that everyone could accept. Rather, truth was relative to each individual or community or group to which they belonged. My PhD explored the understanding of religious belief in the UK with particular reference to the concept of truth as it was reflected by acts of collective worship in a sample of Luton schools. It wasn't long after the passing of the 1988 Education Reform Act in which some of the framework for those acts of collective worship was changed a bit from the 1944 Act. And it was an interesting time in the schools as they developed and worked out what to do. To cut a long story short, the conclusion of that particular doctorate was that religious belief in those particular contexts was being seen as an individually chosen, private, practical guide to living. That's what religious belief was being expressed as in those contexts. In other words, what was going on in this sample of schools, and quite likely in schools across the country, day by day, reflected a postmodern understanding of truth. No longer did it matter whether or not the Christian faith or any other religion or worldview for that matter was true in any overarching sense. The only thing that mattered was that it was true for each individual or group, and it helped to shape their lives. In many ways, I think we're now seeing some of the more anarchic consequences of that extreme relativization of the concept of truth. quite rightly, postmodern philosophers analyse the relationship between truth and power, criticising how both religious belief and also science could claim some kind of priority and absoluteness to their version of reality as a means of imposing that view on others. However, the abandonment of any kind of common truth has led, I think, in many ways to our current so-called post-truth society, in which misinformation and disinformation can be used very widely and with great effect, given the power of social media and the internet. So the truth question is a really important one, both has been, always, I think, and will be going forwards. The third obvious development might be called sociological, partly through the internet and partly through migration and the relative ease of international travel compared with 50 years ago, at least for those with visas. We're now much more aware of different contexts and cultures around the world. There can, of course, be considerable similarities on the surface, but deep down, often there are profound differences in understanding between some of those different contexts. And equally, traditions and practices around the world can sometimes look very different on the surface, but look down a bit deeper and you'll find there's a lot more commonality. Either way, there's much, much more recognition now, I think, about the importance of context in how we see the world and of inter-contextual conversation and engagement in a way that doesn't give an unjustified priority to any one of those particular contexts. So having given a rather personal view on some idea of the last 50 years and how that shaped my approach to science and religion relationships, let me now turn to some of the current developments which also might shape the future. And in this middle section of the lecture, I'm going to talk quite a lot about equipping Christian leadership in an age of science, ECLAS, and the Anglican Communion Science Commission. But first of all, looking around, I do think there's quite a lot of evidence that there is a growing interest in the science and religion engagement, more and more, rather than less and less. I think part of that is because some of the big issues that we face, such as the big overwhelming issues like artificial intelligence and climate change, are obviously global things. You need a global big perspective in order to engage with those issues. But also there's been quite a lot going on in the churches. And there have been many, many examples of exhibitions, and there's a few pictures of some of them, of science-related themes going on within churches. And they've had very good attendance and engagement. One of those has been and some of you may have seen it, the Gaia model, the huge model of the Earth, suspended very often in the middle of the nave of a cathedral, and people stand underneath and walk underneath and reflect, looking back up at the Earth. And that really does make people think, and people from all sorts of different backgrounds have visited those many, many exhibitions that have taken place. And they experience a little bit of what has been called the overview effect. That is, some of the thoughts and feelings and emotions described by astronauts when they look back on the Earth. You get a tiny glimpse of that through the Gaia exhibition. But there's been plenty of examples of really good, interesting exhibitions going on in our churches. Another example, not linked to any particular church or religious background, took place last year when Professor Brian Cox gave what might be called a highly illustrated lecture at the Royal Opera House. It was entitled Symphonic Horizons, and I attended, and it was certainly a pretty full Royal Opera House when I gave it. And in that, he described the wonders of the universe with the help of some marvellous images from the Hubble Space Telescope and from the James Webb Space Telescope, which were magnificent enough in themselves. But importantly, this was interspersed with some very fine orchestral music. If only all lecturers could have an orchestra they could suddenly turn to for a bit of background support, that would be very good. The advertising for this ran as follows. Explore the secrets of the universe with Professor Brian Cox and Daniel Harding in this special event by Britten Sinfonia, combining groundbreaking science with the power of the orchestra, bringing together extraordinary imagery and some of the greatest orchestral music ever written. Professor Cox examines astonishing cosmic ideas and creates the links between cosmology and music by Mahler, Strauss, Sibelius. This show reminds us of what it means to be human, what it means to live a small, finite life in a spectacular universe. And Time Out magazine said this, Professor Brian Cox is a man of big words and bigger questions. What's our place in the universe? What does it all mean? What are we doing here? They're the kind of questions you'll probably struggle to answer in words alone. And part of the reason why Cox is tackling them with an 86-strong symphony orchestra and huge LED screens in one of the most iconic arts venues in the country. And they quote Professor Cox as saying, music is a light you can shine on the problem of existence. Similar events have proved extraordinarily popular. Now the question is, of course, why? They're good entertainment, of course, but there's something deeper going on. And the message which came across to me from this was that words and formulae, even amazing images, were inadequate to express the fullness of human experience in the light of the cosmos. And our sense of awe and wonder requires at least music to embrace it in its depth, but also, I would add, great poetry, great art, philosophy, spirituality, and theology. And all of those lenses are needed if we are to understand the totality of our experience. Another sign of the vibrance of interest in the science and religion area is the continuing work of a significant number of excellent science and religion organisations and networks, of which, of course, the Science and Religion Forum is one. And there are many others, Biologos in the United States, the Faraday Institute in Cambridge, Christians in Science, and so forth. And they are all doing very important and valuable work. Most of those have been founded in a predominantly Western context. And they continue to do important things. But there is awareness that there needs to be far more rooted in other contexts around the world. And I've had the privilege over the last few years of being closely involved with two organisations which are intentionally trying to expand the contextual base of the science and religion organisations. Now, I know that goes on in most of them anyway, in different bits. It's a question of the degree of focus that's going on in trying to create that intercontextual conversation. The first of these is equipping Christian leadership in an age of science. This had its origins around 15 years ago at Durham University in conversations between the project leader, Professor David Wilkinson, and the eminent physicist, Professor Tom McLeish, who sadly died just over 2 years ago, just as the current phase of the project was starting. In their experience, when they began 15 or more years ago, they'd found that a lot of senior church leaders, with a few notable exceptions, were either rather tentative about or not that engaged with the science and religion conversation. And in addition, there was far too much focus on the conflict narrative between science and religion, and far too little on the idea of science as a gift of God to explore God's creation. Since then, ECLAS has been through several different phases, expanding. Now have some folk at the University of York as well as Durham, and also based in London at the Church of England. particularly important was a threefold conversation. Getting into the same room, into the same space, serious world-leading scientists who could come and talk about what they did. Ideally, we would go to the laboratories, to their context where they worked, and they would tell us what they were doing. But you then bring that conversation in with senior church leaders and with some theologians to reflect on the mix of what was going on. And that's proved remarkably productive. And there's been a five-fold strand running through the project pretty much since it started, which has proved remarkably robust and durable in terms of its methodology. There's been some original research into the attitudes of senior church leaders, and one of my colleagues, Toko Kamwendo, is here, who's been undertaking some of that research, and you may learn a bit more later on from her if you want to speak to her. There's also been a large number of conferences for senior church leaders, as I've described. Also, importantly, helping some of those senior church leaders to speak into the public square with good scientific knowledge as well as good theology on matters of public interest, of which there are many. And then importantly, we've been funding some theological colleges and training institutes to build the science-religion engagement into their curricula. And this is not to be done as a separate subject for those who happen to choose it, but built in to the way someone's doctrine is done, the way their biblical studies are done, the way their liturgy is done, the way their pastoral care is done. You build it in to the curriculum. And that's been a very significant part of what we've done. And then there's been some funding. We've already had one pitch for funding. There's also more funding for churches available in the Scientists in Congregations project. And we've funded a large number where a scientist in a congregation has teamed up with a minister or a slightly larger group, and we've had some remarkably good and interesting projects over the years that have been funded. There is real interest there, I can tell you. And to date, we've run 21 conferences for senior church leaders, and these have included people from 13 different denominations and 22 different countries. We've funded 16 Science for Seminaries programs, with a final round to come later this year. So if you happen to be linked to a theological college or institute, there's money coming from down on that. And also over 70 scientists in congregations initiatives, with a final tranche to be announced this summer. And some of the research into attitudes of senior church leaders has also been published. And another member of the ECLAS staff, the Reverend Dr. Catherine Pritchard, has been embedded at the Faith and Public Life Department of the Church of England. And those of you staying for the conference and watching online, she's giving one of the keynotes later on about how some of those senior church leaders have been enabled to make their contributions into the public square on issues such as artificial intelligence and so forth. The aim of ECLAS has been and remains to embed really good science and religion engagement within the structures of the churches, mainstream churches, and also into parachurch organisations where there's a science link. The latest phase of ECLAS began in 2023 and runs for 5 years to the end of 2027. And its main focus is what's the effect of context on the way the science and religion engagement unfolds. And this includes the geographical and cultural context. It includes the theological background and the denominational setting, and we deliberately work ecumenically right across the range, and also the national and political setting. And to this end, we've worked with 4 partner institutions across the world, the Singapore Bible College, who work right across Southeast Asia, the United Theological College in Bengaluru in India, the Nicholas Copernicus University in Poland, and St Paul's University in Limuru in Kenya. And these are in addition to the already existing context link we had with the Dialogue on Science, Ethics and Religion, or DOSA as it's now sometimes known, based at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And the intention in this method of working is emphatically not to export a way of doing things that's been generated in the UK to other parts of the world. Rather, it's to try to seek to create and stimulate good science and religion engagement within those particular contexts. And each partner will be doing their own research into their church leaders in their area, giving out their own grants for science for seminaries and scientists in congregations. And we're actively building a community of conversation between those different contexts. And there's considerable work going on, and Toko's doing quite a bit of it, to explore the research results in those different parts of the world in a manner which is genuinely inter-contextual. And more will come out of that, I'm sure, in the years to come. We're running conferences which involve contributions from all of those partner institutions. Just to give you an example, one which was done a little while ago was called Reading the Bible in an Age of Science, which explored a couple of major questions. How science has changed the way we engage with Scripture, and whether it undermines or enriches our understanding of the Bible. And in that conference, we looked at the question of how does science inform your reading of Genesis 1 to 3? But what wasn't dealt with so much was how the cultural and theological context in which those conversations took place also affected the way it was done, as well as the science. And so we had contributions from Kenya, Poland, Singapore, and the United Kingdom and India. And of course, one of the practical changes which has made this kind of engagement much more realistic to do now is the fact that we've all worked out how to work, well, partially, how to work Zoom and Teams and things like that. So we can actually engage with these conversations much more easily. The visiting, the real in-person stuff is absolutely vital to build that, and it builds off that, but that helps. I've been closely involved with the ECLAS project since it began, and I'm also a member of the Anglican Communion Science Commission, which is another example of an inter-contextual approach to the science and religion relationships. In 2022, the Lambeth Conference of Anglican Bishops, which brings most of them together roughly every 10 years, issued a number of Lambeth calls. There were about 10 of them. And they were exhortations to the churches of the Anglican Communion right around the world on various different topics. And one of them, very significantly, was on faith and science. And it was the first major initiative in that area from a Lambeth conference. And it received the full support of all the Anglican bishops who were there. Now, I can tell you, having been to 2 Lambeth conferences, it is no mean feat to get the full support of all the bishops present on any subject at all. And this was certainly one of them. And the call begins by saying this: the world faces multiple dangers in the coming decade, from climate change and biodiversity loss, poverty, disease, war, famine, and the careless use of new technologies. In the call that follows, the bishops assembled at the Lambeth Conference invite every church of the Anglican Communion to recognise within science God-given resources for the life of faith, and to offer the wisdom of faith to the work of science. We call upon our churches to make this a priority and to support and equip church leaders and scientists in partnership for such courageous and confident leadership. And that call also quoted the now late Pope Francis and an alliance of 40 global faith leaders who said this in October 2021. Faith and science are essential pillars of human civilization. with shared principles and complementarities. We must address the challenges we face using the knowledge of science and the wisdom of religion to know more and to care more. So the Lambeth Conference, through the Lambeth Call, was making a serious call to all the Anglican churches. And it said this at the end: "We call on our churches, working with our ecumenical and interfaith partners and governments where possible, to give this a high priority, to support and equip church leaders and scientists in partnership for such courageous and confident leadership." And to implement that call, a science commission was set up, of which I'm a member, which had a number of senior church leaders from across the world and a number of notable scientists. And each province of the Anglican Communion has been asked to appoint a provincial lead bishop to take that conversation forward. And many of them gathered last October at Virginia Theological Seminary near Washington to move that work on. And it was a privilege to be part of that. Now, in this middle section of the talk, I've not given you really a grand overview, because I think that would be impossible to do. But I've rather given you some examples of things which I think are particularly important looking forward, and give a base for that. So given this widespread interest in science and religion, growing, I think, not just in churches, but around the world, the big question is how these might develop. And so in this final section of the lecture, I want to look about looking forward and what we do with that. And the overall title for this 50th anniversary conference of the Science and Religion Forum, I think, has been well chosen. Revisiting and reimagining the relationships between science and religion. And I'm now going to focus on the reimagining bit of that title. And in particular to look at the significance of context, also the significance of communities, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, of good science-religion conversations, and also the importance of communication to the wider world and why that matters. And I hope that will give at least some stimulation to how we might begin to reimagine the science conversation around the world, and possibly even to build some basic principles for a framework about how that might happen. I am very well aware that there is major expertise represented in many of the talks to be given at this conference in the next few days. And some of those will explore in much more depth the things that I would touch on in this section. And I'm very grateful for all of that. So let me begin with the importance of context. The first obvious question for the Anglican Communion Science Commission when it began was, well, we're all from very, very different places, parts of the world. What impact does that have? There was some clear commonality, but it was very clear in seminars which took place in the Lambeth Conference in 2022 that there was a lot of differences as well. And since the Anglican Communion Science Commission began its work nearly 3 years ago now, there have been 3 regional conferences in different parts of the world. And the results of those were that it was very clear of the importance of valuing all knowledge systems and looking carefully at the impact of context and place when addressing global context, complex global issues. There's going to be some further analysis on some of the work, that work which will emerge in the next year or two, which I think will be very interesting. The final stage of the ECLAS project aimed very deliberately to build a community which focused on the context. And here we have the 4 institutions which I've told you about. St. Paul's University in Limuru in Kenya, the Nicholas Copernicus University in Poland, the Singapore Bible College, and the United Theological College at Bengaluru in India. And in the aim of bringing these partners together, it was to foster regional hubs to develop locally effective tools for catalysing cultural change in the public engagement of churches, and to plant the seeds of new science-engaged theology and to create global networks of learning and practice. And that was in the document which we started off with. In order to look at the impact of context, it's worth looking at it, I think, from three particular angles. And in what follows, I'm simply outlining really the range of questions that get thrown up when you start thinking seriously about context. The first set of questions are of sociological and cultural kind of questions. And one of those, for example, might be, well, what are the untold or less well-told stories of science and religion? There have been, for example, many examples of how contributions made by women have very often not been highlighted. And there's a lot of work going on now to try to make sure that a lot of that people are much more aware of that. Equally, there is a need for a focus on contributions that have been from non-Western focused contexts, and especially how some of those might have been shaped by indigenous knowledge systems. And that might involve, for example, the analysis of power relationships between different knowledge systems, and particularly how that links to all the impact of colonialism and empire and the legacy of all of that that's going on. Another important element in the sociological context is the language in which conversations actually happen and in which academic articles are published. On a recent visit to Singapore Bible College, I had some very interesting discussions about the importance of publishing initially in Chinese rather than English. And behind that, partly, is the prestige of various different academic journals. And it was interesting to observe that in the substantial library of the Singapore Bible College, most of the science and religion books were from a Western context, including some which have been translated then into Chinese. So getting books published in other languages first. I'm not an expert in artificial intelligence, but I'm sure translation techniques must be available to make that more doable in the future. It was also equally obvious that some of the topics that come to the top of the tree in different contexts are actually different. So, for example, in some African situations, issues of the environment and climate change, together with health matters and food supply, are absolutely central. And that's what comes to the top of the page very quickly. And in addition, there's good knowledge of traditional knowledge systems. And there's much more likely to be a background assumption of the reality of the divine and spiritual dimension which pervades the whole way of thinking across those cultures. And that's very different to the often very hard-edged secularism of a Western context, in which religion is regarded very often as a private individual matter. Although it's important to recognise, of course, that even in those Western contexts, there's far more latent spirituality and indications of a desire for a re-enchantment of reality, more along the lines of Gerard Manley Hopkins when he spoke of the world being charged with the grandeur of God. There's more of that going on in Western contexts as well. So this sociological context is important, but also there are important philosophical and conceptual questions which also arise. Firstly, from a scientific point of view, it's really rather problematic to argue that, for example, Chinese science is very different to, say, American science, just to pluck two random examples out of the air. Science depends on provable and repeatable experiments in its essence, where the results don't vary from country to country in which the experiment's done. Newton's laws of motion need to apply everywhere. It may be that modern science has been dominated by a particular worldview rooted in various philosophical assumptions around the Enlightenment, that truth is to be found either via a priori rational thinking or via observation and experiment. And scientific theories are the result of both. But if you're not careful, that can lead to a kind of scientific imperialism, which sees that kind of knowledge as the kind of gold standard of any objective knowledge. There have been many good studies from within the Western tradition arguing that the foundations of science rely on philosophical assumptions which are beyond the ability of science simply to prove. They rest on some of those scientific philosophical assumptions. Roger Trigg's book, Beyond Matter, Why Science Needs Metaphysics, is a good example of that. Another example would be Tom McLeish's 2021 Boyle lecture, Rediscovering Science as Contemplation. So an examination of the different contexts of science and religion raises the important question of truth-seeking. And it's often been said that both science and religion both seek truth in different ways. And we now live in a time when there's a deep mistrust of any claims to truth. Just think Truth Social, for example. Often the aim is simply to convince as many people as possible, using very powerful tools of social media, that your story and account is the most significant one. But the Christian faith, certainly, rooted in the primary reality of God, and good science based on empiricism and rational exploration, I think lead in the direction that there is a deep reality and truth to which all human thinking is reaching. And that leads to the final context of the theological or spiritual context. The ECLAS project has very deliberately tried to focus right across the range of the denominations. So to give an example, we recently held last month a session with some senior Pentecostal church leaders, and we met at the Royal Society in London for a fascinating conversation about how science and religion issues played out in their particular churches and contexts. And in addition to issues around creation and evolution, there were important questions about healthcare and healing. And often, one of the substantial lessons from this kind of engagement, for me certainly, is that it's very, very foolish to caricature particular types of viewpoint. Once you actually start talking with real people from real places, you suddenly find the context and their views are much more nuanced than you might have thought prior to the conversation. So with all this emphasis on context, how do we stop the science and religion conversation breaking down into regional groups? And this brings me to the importance of community. A principal aim of the ECLAS project was to create a community a global community of inquiry. Each partner hub is developing its own understanding in their context. And then we look to try to ensure how those conversations can happen. So we've had monthly online meetings, we've had several in-person meetings, and they've proved very, very helpful and interesting conversations. Back in 2008, the Lambeth Conference of Anglican Bishops adopted a method of engagement called Indaba, which very deliberately made attempts to listen very carefully to the different contexts and not to descend into an adversarial approach, and an awareness of the impact of context and all of those things. And in a similar kind of way, in the ECLAS context and also in the Anglican Communion Science Commission context, there's been a serious attempt to build those conversations in different places, and a serious kind of way of listening. So if you like, a moral context in which we engage with one another. There's also another crucial foundation, and that is to do with the pursuit of truth. I think without a common understanding that there is some sort of truth, and I put that in inverted commas because I know it's a complicated concept, there is some sort of truth to which we are seeking. But by doing this conversation in this inter-contextual way, where you very deliberately bring in different backgrounds and contexts, you actually get a much deeper understanding and new ideas start developing, which go beyond the mobilities of any one person or place. Right back in the late 16th and early 17th century, Francis Bacon, leading figure in the development of natural philosophy and scientific method, said this: "The inquiry of truth, which is the love-making or wooing of it, the knowledge of truth, which is the presence of it, the belief in truth, which is the enjoying of it, is the sovereign good of human nature." So I think he was onto something there, which still remains true. That the truth-seeking part is very important. And that's part of the glue that holds the conversations together. And it's not necessarily that we're seeking to create a monochrome thing that actually, yes, everyone agrees on every detail of this, but rather that the truth is much deeper, much more profound than any of us had thought. So the truth-seeking is extraordinarily important. Part of that conversation, and I'm very glad it's part of the Science and Religion Forum, I think, is to extend that conversation into an interfaith one and into people with other worldviews as well. And I think when it's well done, those sorts of conversations can work extremely well and be very fruitful. A very important part of that is what I could call bridge people. And that is folk who actually have lived and worked genuinely and deeply in different cultures, and very often can be really crucial in terms of facilitating those cultures, those contexts to happen. And it's one of the reasons why I think it would be extraordinarily good, and maybe we could spend some of all that Hibbert money on it, in enabling younger people to live and learn in different contexts around the world at an early stage in their careers, to develop that kind of bridge person who can very often be very helpful. So let me finish with the last person about the importance of communication. And this is a rather shorter section to finish with. It would be of relatively little significance, I think, if lots of interesting science and religion conversations were to happen with a relatively small number of people talking to each other in great depth, with however much deep understanding, if the fruits of those conversations aren't shared much more widely into our society and into our world. In 2012, I was privileged to have a sabbatical of 3 months, which I spent in Berkeley in California. And having been a bit busy, having done 10 years by then of bishoping, doing the day-to-day bishoping bit, I thought I'll go and get myself more up to date with the science and religion literature. That was my aim when I went. What I came back with was something rather different. I did learn a bit more about the amazing literature there is, and some of the people here will have contributed to that. But what came back for me was the challenge for someone like me as a senior church leader was, how do you communicate this? How do you get it embedded in the life of the churches, in the life of our education system, and in the life of our world? That education, that wider communication, was a serious piece of work to do. And it needed to happen at all those levels, into the churches, into the education system, other faith communities, and into wider society. So just for example, many of you here will be very familiar with some of the questions in churches. How do we understand when you say a prayer for someone who's ill? How do you understand the divine action which you might think might come as a result of that prayer with medical science and what that tells you? It's a serious question. And there are lots of other questions as well of that type. It's very important to have a confident Christian faith in the 21st century that we actually engage with all of those questions. and that it also helps to make the Christian faith seem more credible. In the education system, certainly in the UK, there's relatively little taught on the history and philosophy of science, and relatively little space for good interaction between the science and religion issues. One of the joys of visiting schools as a bishop, once they knew I'd got a scientific background, was that I automatically created an interdisciplinary space by walking in. And the questions poured out of the youngsters are in these areas. The questions are there. It's a question of how we shape the curriculum to make that a real possibility. So there's a lot more on the history, the philosophy, the sociology, the context of science, how science works, what its limits are, and so forth. There have been several really good projects on that. The God and the Big Bang project, for example, Big Questions in the Classroom, funded by Templeton, the Faraday Institute, the Epistemic Insights project done at Christ Church University in Canterbury. And all of those have done really good work in education, and that's to be continued. And the Royal Society, one of the oldest and most eminent organisations, has an education policy which encourages interdisciplinary approach that not only leads to good and deep understanding of particular sciences, but enables those scientists to see how their science works in the wider context of human knowledge and society. And of course, we live in a world where something like a third of the population of the world are in some sense Christian, a quarter Muslim. We are certainly in a deeply religious world. It may not seem like that when you live in a rather more secularised part of it, but that's the way the world is. In wider society, I'm very pleased there's an emphasis on that education side in the conference. In wider society, there's also a tremendous examples of where the science-religion relationship can be really caricatured in the direction of the conflict narrative. Unfortunately, I haven't got time to show you some of them now, but there are some very, very funny comedy routines which basically are built on caricaturing science, as this is proper knowledge, and caricaturing religion, that you've got to take your brain out to believe this sort of stuff, and that's why the comedy works. And those things have their effect if you don't stop and critique them. You also see it in documentaries. There was one I watched some years ago, it was on cosmology, that roughly began like this. What you've got to watch out for is how they're framed, the science documentaries, the beginnings and the endings. And this one started roughly like this. For thousands of years, humankind has looked up at the skies, and all they've had to guide them is all this myth and folklore and religious stuff. Now we've got these wonderful telescopes, all this cosmology, and we'll give you the real story. And off you go. Well, of course, smuggled into that has been some serious epistemological assumptions into that. So it's really important that into wider society we get some of these things, which is why some of the more popular expressions are important. And it's very important too, and I think there's a growing awareness of this, because so many of the major issues we now face are so overwhelming, like artificial intelligence, like environment and climate change, and so forth, the list could go on, that most people are realising you really do need the good science plus the spirituality, the theology, the ethics. They all need to come together. And so there's a real, I think, open door. And we've certainly found with a lot of the leading scientists that we've engaged with in the ECLAS project, they are only too happy to talk about what they do and some of the issues around all of that. So let me draw to a close. I'm very aware that what I've just said in this lecture almost inevitably reflects my own context as someone predominantly shaped in a Western cultural situation. One of the enormous benefits from an inter-contextual approach to science and religion is that it offers a real possibility of deepening and broadening our understanding, bringing in other knowledge systems which have things genuinely to say into a creative dialogue. and the conflict narrative then begins to fall away. And that kind of material is now being produced both within the ECLAS project and also in the Anglican Communion Science Commission, and I'm sure in other places as well. And I'm sure that that will continue and will continue to be for the benefit of all. Both science and religion are extraordinarily powerful things. Both can be life-giving and truth-giving. Both can be toxic if they are misused and distorted. We need to be aware of the enormous power of science, but also of its limits. If it becomes a total worldview, a kind of scientism, then we've lost its way. In the Christian faith, we need both the book of Scripture and the book of nature to understand the deepest realities of God. We need a proper respect for the role of our God-given reason and also the gift of science. As Einstein once said, famously said, science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. Or rather more mundanely, as in the title of the last year's Boyle Lecture by Archbishop Aunt J. Jacqueline, science and religion are a necessary partnership. A crucial components of that necessary partnership going forward, I suggest, are the impact of context and creating intercontextual communities of conversation around the world, and a deliberate attempt and a focused attempt to communicate that much more widely around the world. So that, I hope, will give some way forward into the future. One last very brief thought. The point of contact between science and religion is not only in the importance of reason, but also in our contemplation, our sense of awe and wonder in the light of creation. So as well as our intellectual arguments and our words, we would also do very well to spend rather more time in contemplative reflection to shape and guide us into the future. But I rather think that would be the subject of another lecture. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bishop Richard. Before we move on to our respondent who will be joining us online, I'm going to suggest we take just a short 3-minute break to stretch our legs and have a comfort break if you need it, and then we will regather in just a brief 3 minutes to have our respondent. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to welcome as our respondent this evening Dr. Muthraj Swamy. Dr. Swamy is the director of the Cambridge Centre for Christianity Worldwide, where he teaches and supervises in the University of Cambridge and the Cambridge Theological Federation. He is also involved with the ECLAS project and supports the work of the Anglican Communion Science Commission. His interests and research are in the fields of religious studies, theology and world Christianity, and religious pluralism, interfaith dialogue, and ecumenism and contextual theologies. And so I can think of no one better to give the response to Bishop Richard's Gowland Lecture. Muthraj, it's great to have you joining us this evening.
Good evening, everyone. Let me begin with expressing my sincere thanks to the organizers of this conference on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Science and Religion Forum. My thanks especially to you, Reverend Jennifer Brown, for your kind invitation to join this event, the Gowland Lecture. Thank you very much, Bishop Richard, for your fascinating lecture, which is really enriching. Your way of presenting it, beginning with your own story, your background, your upbringing, and your interests, and how these have shaped the ways you look at science and religion relations. And structuring your presentation in terms of looking back, looking around, and looking forward is excellent. And in the looking forward section, the three areas you highlight, the context, community, and communication. This is very helpful for thinking about ways to take science-religion engagement beyond the current levels and beyond the current locations. What I'm trying to do here is to offer some general reflections in the light of what you have said, and then we'll go into a conversation. At the outset, please allow me to begin with briefly sharing about my own background and how I have come to look at science-religion relations and to engage in this work. I come from India and did much of my education, including theological education, in India, except my doctoral work, which was at the University of Edinburgh, for which I did an ethnographic study of Hindu, Christian, Muslim relations. Later, I taught in theological colleges in India before moving again to UK. A convert from Hindu religious tradition to Christian faith at a very young age, I grew up with my Hindu and Christian siblings, Hindu relatives, and Muslim neighbors. Such a multi-religious community life in an ordinary and everyday setting where people live with their multiple identities has been the lens through which I see the world mostly. The interconnections shaping our individual and community lives, whether we realize that or not, whether we acknowledge that or not, and whether we like that or not. I see insularities in society that try to erect walls in community life are something that are always problematic, especially in the Indian context, which is ripe for communal conflicts, where violence is often produced for vested interest rather than spontaneously happen. Community cohesion and harmonious life is very important. This is what led me to focus on interfaith relations, and this is the route through which I came to view science-religion relations too. The importance of interconnections and partnerships that are necessary for the social well-being, here in this case, between science and religion. And together with that, another key issue which has drawn me into science-religion engagement is in theological education and church ministry settings in India, I have often seen a lack of confidence and interest to engage with science, especially among people who do not have a background in science education at the university level. Thank you, Bishop Richard, for your many observations and reflections in the light of your experiences, especially the lack of focus on the history, philosophy, or sociology of science in curriculum, which you have addressed, which continues to be an issue in several contexts, including in India. Even though this has been changing and there have been good developments during the last few years or so, this still continues to be a key issue. Also, as you rightly observe, the context is always important for theologizing, but this was seldom articulated before the arrival of liberation theology and other contextual theologies. I think this contribution from liberation theology to science-religion engagement is crucial to note and needs to be developed further. Your critique of postmodernism reminds me of similar critiques I have come across in India. Meera Nanda, a scholar from India, in several of her works, especially in her book, Prophets Facing Backward, Postmodern Critics of Science and Hindu Nationalism in India, she argues how postmodernism has led to undermine scientific truths and towards several forms of pseudoscience that the Hindu nationalist forces in India are promoting. The same critique can be applied when it comes to the onslaught of truth in the religious realms too. Having said that, I must admit, I do find postmodernism helpful, particularly with its critique of absolute or monopolization of power, as you rightly point out. And this also leaves a challenge when we think about indigenous science, how we are to differentiate between science that helps and science or pseudoscience that is political, ideological, and problematic to the larger society. In your looking around what is happening in terms of the work done by ECLAS and the Anglican Communion Science Commission, you record very well the growing interest in positive and constructive science-religion engagement in church circles, which was not the case a few years ago. Gaia exhibition in churches you mentioned is a great example. It offers an experience of engaging with the world in the church. When it comes to the church and the world, most often we talk about the church in the world. But here, what we see is the world in the church. When my own priest ordination took place at in the Ely Cathedral, it was wonderful to see this world that was hanging around within the church. Another thing in the context of science-religion engagement is how we read the Bible and how we interpret it, and how to preach from the Bible, especially keeping in mind the difficult issues and themes in terms of science-religion engagement. Most of the time we hear familiar stories, familiar interpretations, avoiding engaging with more difficult texts. Your discussion of the Lambeth Call, coming from the Lambeth Conference 2022, encouraging Christians to engage with science, and the follow-up work by Anglican Science Commission, all these developments are very encouraging. In order to take Christian engagement with science further, or we may call it from peripheries to the center in church life, the three aspects you suggest are very significant: the context, community, and communication. I believe this line of thought is crucial for the future of Christian engagement with science. In how the context shapes science-religion engagement, so that's the current phase of ECLAS work you have described, your observation about the resources in local languages is very important, and using artificial intelligence for translations will be a great milestone, I think. This helps with making resources available in contexts beyond the West and contexts where there is a dire need for these resources. Together with this, what we'll need also are resources that are developed locally with the local knowledge and in the light of local contextual realities. So in this process, some of the existing resources from the Western context also, can be put in dialogue or in conversation with the local knowledge and local realities. Your observations about the Singapore context are quite illuminating. And I would like to pick up two things here. So the one is a pragmatic approach that you have observed in Singapore, as well as that the strong political emphasis on the harmony of society there is really an advantage. In the Indian context, the latter is different and challenging, as many of you may be aware of it, especially given the ongoing current political climate. The second thing about Singapore is your observation about the younger generation who are interested in a more holistic approach in which modern science and their Christian faith were much more directly related. It reminds me of similar experience I have heard when visiting and speaking in churches in Mumbai a few years ago. I saw young Christians who are fully into their science career but easily connected their experiences with their work experiences with their Christian faith and church life, rather than treating that these two are different or irreconcilable. I really admire the way they were articulating this. A few further thoughts on the context. While thinking about the importance of the context to include both the Western realities and realities outside the West, I think it is not just the contextual differences between the Western world and the world outside that are important, but also the many other that shape Christian engagement with science. For example, I always think science religion engagement in India today cannot be thought about outside the Hindu nationalist ideologies and policies, which throw many challenges to religious minorities, including Christians, as well as to other minorities. In other words, the science religion engagement issue in India is closely connected with the issue of the freedom of religion. The second is the variety of ways in which Christians in these different contexts engage with science. We may kind of try to get like a Western attitude or non-Western attitude, but obviously, the complexities that within each of these global South context, again, there are different sections of Christians responding to science and engaging with science in different way. Coming to the community section, while thinking about the importance of community, building a community of conversation as ECLAS and the Anglican Science Commission are working to do is really excellent. Especially the 5 hubs working together internationally and learning from each other. And as you emphasize, building communities and partnerships around truth seeking is crucial, rather than holding on to absolute truth claims. A major challenge to building a community of conversation comes from the world today, which we experience as hyper-connected, yet also fragmented. I often think that the irony is that fragmentation is very easy and quick in a hyper-connected world. It only shows the importance of strong, stable, and lasting communities and partnerships in science, religion, engagement in different contexts of the world. I really like your idea of bridging people. I have sometimes reflected about this in world Christianity, the field I'm currently working in, that how individuals with considerable experience in different cultures and have the ability to understand at least 2 of them in fuller way, as you say, can become key people in building these small communities, which is important. Of course, your observation about the challenges to such formations under the current global realities is very real. Coming to the communication section, as you rightly point out, a major challenge remains is how to communicate. The ideas and resources developed in science, religion engagement, as well as the conversations developed by people involved. Especially given that misinformation and disinformation move very quickly in our world today, this is a huge challenge indeed. The other aspect is the interdisciplinarity in education that you emphasize. In the Indian theological curriculum too, I have often observed that in spite of some good developments, a long way to go about this, especially when it comes to Christians engaging with science. Let me conclude with a few final thoughts and points for conversation. Together with you, I believe that the above three aspects, the context, community, and communications, are vital in taking science religion engagement from periphery to the center in church life and in theological education. I am reminded of how science and religion relations that began as a small unit, one of the 10 units in a 10-week module in the theological methodology module that I learned as part of my undergraduate course at the United Theological College, Bangalore, one of the ECLAS hubs, which was, this unit developed in the 1990s, is now 2 full courses, 1 core and 1 optional for the whole of Sarambur University in India, in which more than 60 theological colleges are part of. Second, science religion engagement is to be seen and developed taking into account broader factors at play in terms of community relations in each given context. For instance, reflecting further on the distrust of scientists and politicians during the COVID-19 pandemic that you mentioned, some of those responses from people showed that many from the African communities on whom the Western countries had conducted vaccine experiments in the past and who have faced the consequences of eugenics had a distrust of new vaccines due to their past experiences. At the same time, we also saw some communities, including some sections of Christians, had their distrust because they came to see that lockdown was affecting their freedom. The same distrust, but for different reasons. For me, this shows that science religion engagement is connected with and conditioned by other factors where true engagement and reconciliation is necessary. Third, one area which is underexplored but have a lot of potential is the need to bring science religion engagement and interfaith relations in conversation and how they can work together. This can benefit both these fields and the wider society. So your ending of your lecture with an invitation to contemplation is really good. Critical reasoning and contemplating going together. I am reminded of seeing a statement in an hospital run by the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the city of Pune in India. When the patients come out of the hospital, they read a board, a few words on a board, which says something like this: we only give medicine, it is God who heals. We only give medicine, it is God who heals. I see here human responsibility and faith in divine providence, joining together, or as he said, critical reasoning and contemplation, medicine and prayer helping together. Both science and faith need humility in what they each do, and they need confidence in each other's ability to participate. Thank you, Bishop Richard, and thank you everyone for listening.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions, and I've already had one come in online, but we'll start in the room. So, wait for me to bring you the microphone.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for the very enlightening talk on the importance of context. Do people see me? I'm Joseph here, doctoral student at Oxford University. And but throughout your talk, I was wrestling with a conceptual question. And the question has a premise. The premise is that any intelligible conversation must happen in a particular shared context. So if the two parts coming from two dissimilar contexts, they won't be able to understand each other at all. There must be a shared common ground for there to be mutual understanding. And so in light of this premise, I was wrestling with the question, how is it possible to have non-privileging inter-contextual conversations? So it seems to me that either we have no privileged context, and whatever attempt at fruitful dialogue becomes simultaneous monologues where people talk across each other because their contexts are too dissimilar to understand each other, or a context is privileged ipso facto by the conversation, mutually intelligible conversation taking place in that context. And I wonder how you would answer this dilemma, and where have my thinking gone wrong? Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Shall I give a response first before, and then Muthraj? I think my sense is that if these intercontextual conversations are going to work, as you rightly said, there are often very big differences. So how does the thing hold together? I think there are two key foundations, if you like, to make the thing work. One is an understanding of epistemology in a way, that we are together, we are truth seeking. Now, Muthraj put it rather well in his reply. It's not that I've got the absolute truth and that's it, but together we are truth seeking, that there is something to be found, that truth doesn't simply collapse into each individual's view, competing with one another. So that there is a reality, our understanding of God, our understanding of God's creation. There is a reality out there to be sought, to be understood, to be lived with, to be contemplated. So the truth-seeking part of it, I think, is really important. The second foundation, I think, is probably moral or ethical, how we listen and treat one another. There's a wonderful phrase that you look at some conversations that are going on between people and you think, well, they're not, every time someone goes quiet, they're not really listening, they're just reloading, waiting to fire back and demolish the other person's point of view. So I think there's an ethical thing there about how you do the conversations, that you go out of your way to make sure you try and understand what's it like for this person in this context, and how do I understand, how does that begin to challenge me in my context? That intentional listening and that involves a mutual respect as well. So I think those would be totally, but Muthraj may have some other things to add for us.
No, I think I will go with what you said, kind of basing on that the truth seeking as as the key aspect that really so there is this element of openness. I mean, I always believe that when kind of even sometimes I say very bit of maybe that may look like simpler way or funny way, but I always believe that when it comes to thinking about God or talking about God, if we say that, we know everything about God, then for me, God ceases to be God because we know everything about God. We are actually one step further. So there is always more to learn about God and seek about God. And the same with science. Though there might be different perspectives. So yeah, the truth seeking will be, the seeking aspect will be quite key. And as you, Bishop Richard said, that brings that listening and openness and this learning aspect into that. And I mean, that leads to that shared context experience.
I will take us to the question that's come in online, which starts, thank you for one of the most appropriate Gowland lectures. I wonder whether you would comment further on the political context of our enterprise, which reflects the power that both science and faith have in society. So I think getting at the political influences.
Yes, I mean, that clearly varies from context to context. Muthraj, we've all been through the experience of the pandemic when we had the follow the science mantra, which on one level was quite good because it was a nod in the direction of, oh yes, science does give us some really important knowledge that is reliable and good. But of course, it's not as simple as that, because not only was there a lot of mistrust of politicians, there's also in some communities considerable mistrust of the science. And part of that is where the shadow of some eugenics and inappropriate experimentation with various medicines, and that leaves a very long shadow in some communities. And so the political aspects are always sitting there in these conversations. And Muthraj, you were talking about the context in India with the impact of the Hindu nationalism as well, and how that, I don't know if you want to add anything about, from an Indian context, how that impacts on that question.
Yeah, I mean, as I put in the response, I mean, that will be a kind of a long thing. So what I'll try to say very briefly, maybe repeating what I said there. As a Christian in India, how I see is that because the Hindu nationalism has a particular view of science, and which is called generally pseudoscience. Some people may disagree with that, but it is not simply about science, but also it has an attitude towards other people, towards religious minorities. That's why I often think that it is not simply a science religion issue. It is actually a freedom of religion issue for religious minorities, because when you see that in the political context, and some of, like Meera and others, have been trying to, through their works, to critique that, how this particular context within which these science religion engagements. Even I go to the extent of sometimes saying that the science religion relations in India is misused by the ideological forces, the Hindu nationalist forces, for their advantage. They think that, okay, this is a good way to blend together Vedic science and I mean Vedic religion and science, and bringing together Vedic science. Yes, the wider political context, maybe in different ways, in different contexts, is always important, and they will have an impact on what we do in terms of science religion engagement.
I could add another example to that of on a recent visit to Singapore a couple of months ago. One of the fascinating things that was said to me was that it's a society that's very deliberately and politically harmonious, a very, very varied society, but in a way that open conflict doesn't happen in quite the same way. And that has an effect, so for example, on the conflict narrative of science. You don't have a ding-dong over science and religion in church. It gets sort of not really dealt with at all because you need to get on and to be harmonious. And that was partly a result of the way that that country has been forged since its independence, very deliberately to try and keep the harmony in that way. And an interesting thing there, I didn't go into it in depth, but Muthraj referred to it in his response. Younger people are more interested in that was coming out. So an older generation of people in Singapore were not dealing with those issues. Younger people were. And my suspicion is that'll be replicated in different parts of the world. I can't say that for sure. We'll find out that from some of our partners. So you can't suppress it. There's more interest amongst younger people now.
It's commonplace these days to assume that we've moved beyond the conflict thesis, at least amongst serious theologians and professional scientists, and we embrace dialogue. But there has grown recently in certain more arcane philosophical theological circles a view that seeks to dismantle even the categories of science and theology. I'm thinking here of the after science and theology movement, the radical orthodoxy people who basically are almost rehabilitating the conflict thesis. Therefore, my question is, does theology, at least Christian theology in this country, need to get its house in order before we can even start to try to encourage more harmony worldwide?
Yes, I'm not quite sure whether theology will ever get its house in order. Something will pop up in different... People ask questions, people think. But I do think it's worth thinking hard about what we think science actually is, what it does, how it works, what the limits of science are, what kind of questions science can legitimately ask and deal with. And a lot of the problems come when science overreaches itself and becomes the classic scientism thing, that this is the only kind of question that's worth asking. And similar sorts of questions, I think, arise with religious faith, because again, that gets massively caricatured in wider society. And again, thinking deeply about the nature of faith. And remember, the word faith, it's to do with trust in what we ultimately trust, and that shapes our lives. So it's not a kind of blind, take your brain out, I believe any old thing in this religion. It's a faith that guides you. And I think it goes beyond reason. It is, we are more than thinking animals. It is to do with our emotions, our ethic, the whole lot, our spirituality. So I think understanding the nature of faith, the nature of theology, that critical thinking on what these two categories actually are needs to continue and will continue. But again, it'll be different in different contexts in the world. So Muthraj may have a reflection on that.
Thank you for this question. I mean, I'll kind of do this generally. I mean, what I immediately think about, that question is actually the need for the self-critical element here. I mean, as you Bishop Richard said, whether we'll put that in order or not, we don't know. But what can happen is at least this self-critical element. And what I see sometimes is that maybe knowingly or unknowingly, even in the science religion engagement, sometimes as theologians, as Christians, we may tend to put the kind of maybe this may not be the right way of describing it, but put the blame on, for the status of society, we put the blame on what science is, doing, or maybe, like science is not humble enough, or maybe, I mean, there's a lot of interpretations. But and I am involved in a project, a similar project where there is a kind of a description of secularism and what secularization is doing to the current society and all that. And also, Bishop Richard, as you mentioned, this about the re-enchantment or disenchantment, that happens about maybe the material world or the way we treat the world. Again, I think that the dominion theologies which are responsible for that. So all that lead me to I often reflect on that question in terms of the need for self-reflection. So before we critique maybe the other, maybe how sometimes things are not going within the theological circle when it comes to science, which is very important.
Thank you. I'm aware that we are running a few minutes over time, so thank you all very much for your patience. But I think we could probably take one more question if we have any. Have we had anything else come in online? No. Right.
Just going back to the COVID context, I mean, I perceive that the very language the politicians wanted to use of the science was quite disrespectful to what science is, because science itself is a matter of conversation. There are people coming from different places, and in your later response you began to talk about asking the question of what science is, but the kinds of assumptions that were painted onto scientists was putting them in an impossible situation, asking them to in fact take responsibility or answer questions which science itself is not really covering that area. So I just think that the complexity of COVID did quite added to a misunderstanding of what science is. Yeah, it's just a comment, really.
Yeah. And I think, just as a brief response, I think that underlines why the educational challenge is such a significant one. So that the way science is taught in schools, that we have generations of people coming through where those questions are deliberately engaged with and thought about in a much deeper way.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you very much, Bishop Richard and Muthraj. It's been wonderful to hear from both of you. I think there's really excellent lecture and response as well that I think we've all found really helpful in stimulating some thinking about the context in which we have this science and religion dialogue. So can we please thank our lecturer and respondent one more time?
Thank you.